002 Limited against the decision of North Hertfordshire District Council to refuse planning permission for construction, operation and decommissioning of a solar farm with the capability to export and import up to 49.9 megawatts of electricity at any time, comprising the installation of ground-mounted fixed solar panels, associated energy storage and ancillary development, including customer and DNO substation, inverter and transformer stations, fencing, security cameras, landscape planting and associated works, including grid connection, at land northeast of Wandon End, North Hertfordshire, LU2 8PS. Can I just remind everyone to make sure that their phones and other electronic devices are either on silent or switched off? This is the second day of the inquiry. Yesterday we heard representations from various third parties and started the council's evidence on landscape matters, which we'll be continuing with to start with before moving on to the appellant's evidence on the same matter. But before we resume, I think you said there's going to be a fire alarm today, didn't you?
Yes, that'll be about 11 o'clock.
Right.
A test.
Well, that'll be a good time to have a break, won't it?
I do. Yeah.
And just one message from me. I did some work on the conditions last night. So there'll be something coming through to you from the case officer in Bristol. There's nothing major. I think just once you get the clean copy, it's easier just to see. So I haven't done track changes. I've just marked things I've changed in red. It's things like we've missed off approved in writing by the LPA and a couple of ones, things like that. So there's nothing too major. But that will be coming through for you today just to have a look at. So is there any other housekeeping matters?
Can I just check the inquiry documents list that it corresponds with yours? I've just got 4 documents so far.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. On that basis, Ms. Osman-Smith, would you like to continue your cross-examination?
Thank you. Yes, I would. And good morning to you. And good morning, Mr. Reynolds.
Good morning.
Would you like a document refresh as to what we're going to need?
It's okay. I've got my pile and anything else I can look up.
Well, it was mainly for the inspector, Mr. Reynolds, but Mum, do you need? Okay. Yes, that's fine. So I think probably useful to get the enhanced mitigation strategy, core document 8.3.1, inquiry document 1, which is the tables, core document 117, which is the LVIA methodology. (3.1.1), which is the officer report. The landscape partnership response, which is called document 7.18, the second one of 2. And then the final 2 documents are 5.2.1 B and C, which is the airport DCO examining authorities report and decision letter. Super. Thank you very much. Good. Right, Mr. Reynolds, the next issue I want to talk to you about is the point you raise in respect of tunnelling a footpath through the site because of the hedgerows that are going to be put on either side as part of the mitigation for the scheme. And by tunnelling, you mean that these routes are going to be enclosed by hedgerows?
On both sides, yeah.
Yeah. And just to understand the point, can we take out the EMS, the enhanced mitigation strategy, and just identify where this particular effect would occur?
Yeah.
And make sure we agree on it. I've got the footpath between field 5 and field 11. Then it happens between field 10 and 14 and 12 and 15 on that sort of east-west footpath through the site,
Yep.
yes? And also between field 16 and 17.
Yep.
Yeah. So we agreed that those are the places where the effect arises.
And possibly between 14 and 13, because that's where the proposed additional planting is on the edge, the field 13 side of it.
Yeah, so that's going to be yeah, and with 13 on the other side, there's no panels in that. That's going to be an open access field for people to be able to walk across with children, dogs, or by themselves if they choose.
Yeah, but the footpath that runs between 14 and 13, there's planting proposed on both sides of that footpath.
Okay, so I've marked that up. So that's where the effect has a potential to occur. I wonder, Mr. Reynolds, have you taken the trouble to measure the width of the proposed greenways or green lanes,
Yep.
these footpaths you have? And what does that tell you about the width of them?
Doesn't tell me very much, really. It just tells me that they're paths that run between two hedges.
Okay, and what's the width
I think it was
of the space?
just over 3 meters, I think.
3 meters.
That's what it says in the document.
That's what you've calculated the width between hedgerows to be. How have you calculated that, Mr. Reynolds?
Well, measuring off the drawing, and I think it was stated in one of the documents as well.
Did you measure that at A1 as the drawing was meant to be? Did you measure an A1 copy?
Yes, the scale of the drawing.
So your understanding, just so I can understand, because I'll ask Mr. Morris about this in his evidence, your understanding of these routes is that the corridor proposed between two hedges, as you put it, is going to be a 3 meter width way.
Broadly speaking, yeah.
Broadly speaking. So that's what you've based your assessment on.
Yeah, but what I should say is that the width of the corridor is irrelevant to the point around tunnelling. The point around tunnelling is that the view is obscured to the left and to the right. So the width of the path isn't really relevant in any way, shape, or form, because it's about it's a visual impact caused by the obstructions. Whether they're here or here or here, it still blocks the views. The point is you lose the open views across the fields.
Okay, so help me understand the point. Your point is not that these footpaths would be an unpleasant place to walk as a result of having hedgerows on either side.
My point is there'll be an unattractive...
Well, no, deal with the question I'm asking.
Yeah, it is that there'll be an unpleasant place to walk.
You think there'll be an unpleasant place to walk?
Yes, because
Okay.
the open views across the countryside will be lost.
So they'll be unpleasant, but not because there's some sort of oppressive effect that's caused by the hedgerows.
No.
Well, I'm trying to explore this with you. So it is simply the loss of views.
Yeah, the tunnelling. So
Yeah.
it's a tunnel vision. You can only look straight ahead. There's no views at sort of 90-degree views through the view. That's
Yeah.
the point. That's what the tunnelling means.
Is it an unpleasant experience to walk a footpath in the countryside between hedges? Is that your evidence?
It is, yeah.
You think that's an unpleasant experience?
Yeah.
And that's what's informed the level of effects that you've identified?
The loss of view. Because what you do is you have your baseline, which is an open, expansive view across the countryside. And then in the proposed, that view is lost and all you have is a forward view or a backward view, obviously, if you turn around. So that is what my assessment has looked at. It's looked at the baseline open view versus the future non-open view.
Yeah. Well, that's a change, isn't it? What you're identifying there is a change from what the position presently is to what it will be.
Yeah.
But what you've also said is that experience in and of itself of walking along a footpath with hedges on both sides is an unpleasant one.
Yeah, it's less pleasant than having an open view, yes.
Well, that's different. Less pleasant or unpleasant. Which one is it, Mr. Reynolds? Because you said unpleasant.
I think it could be unpleasant, yeah.
You think it could be unpleasant. So the inspector then is to note that all over the country where this happens, where there are routeways that are surrounded on both sides by hedgerows and trees, be them footpaths or other greenways, bridleways, for example, that's to be regarded as an unpleasant experience.
I think if you have 3 meter high vegetation on both sides of you, it makes for an unpleasant experience.
And that will, let's just deal with that. I mean, that's something I'm going to make clear I disagree on. But that will depend, of course, what the proximity of those hedges is to the person who's walking the paths.
Not materially. It will have an impact on it, but it doesn't make a material difference to, as I said, the material issue is the loss of view. And it doesn't matter whether the hedge is 1 metre away or 5 metres away, you lose the view across.
Because people choose to walk through, for example, woodlands, don't they, Mr. Reynolds?
Yeah, they do.
People view that as a pleasant experience where
But
trees will block.
see through the trees. You have understory. You don't. People choose to walk through the tree canopies higher, and you can look through. You still get very good views, long distant views.
Well, I mean, it very much depends upon the woodland you're in.
I don't think there's very many woodlands where you don't get any views at ground level.
Oh, perhaps you've not visited Shropshire. But anyway, the inspector can use, I'm sure, her own experience to understand what the nature of those views will be and where people choose to walk and why. But it will depend. There will be an effect. Say, for example, if the corridor is 7 or 9 metres wide, that's going to be a different experience, isn't it, to someone who's on a footpath?
It'll be a different experience, but it still won't remove the fact you're foreshortening the view and you're losing the expansive view you've got at the moment.
Yeah. Can we?
Obviously, there'll come a point where, like, if it's 100 metres wide, then that's probably what the field is anyway, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
the width of the corridor is relevant, isn't it?
it is, yeah.
It is. And we can agree.
I don't think they're that wide. So
you don't think they're that wide?
No.
Okay. Did you ask for the any of the drawings that support the EMS, the base drawings so it could be measured properly?
Did I ask for them?
Yeah.
Well,
Did you ask Mr. Morris for them?
I've got the drawings.
You've got the EMS. Did you ask for the file that sits behind that can be measured using computer technology?
I can measure this using computer technology. I don't need any other version.
All right. Well, I can ask Mr. Morris what his view of your evidence on that is. And in terms of the footpaths throughout the site, obviously we know that this is an area that's well served by the footpath network.
Yeah.
Have you calculated what proportion of the footpaths on site would be affected by that particular form of mitigation and that which wouldn't?
Not a percentage, no.
Now, you recognise in your assessment of visual impacts that people use the lanes around the site for recreation.
Yes.
And you've identified Lower Road, Wandon End Road, Stony Lane. Those are all receptor groups that you've assessed in your proof of evidence.
Yeah.
At paragraph 4.270 on page 34, for example.
Yeah.
So 4270 and 4271, you're describing users Low Road, Wandon End Road, Stony Lane, Darley Road.
Yeah.
And what you say about those is that receptors using that will be medium high in terms of their sensitivity because they're used for recreation.
Yes.
Now, those routes, the inspector will have some familiarity with them, but they are at times narrow stretches of highway bound on both sides by vegetation, trees and hedgerows, aren't they?
Yep.
People using those for recreation obviously do not regard it as undesirable that they are on a narrow stretch of road, often a single carriageway of around 3 metres, surrounded by hedgerows.
No, but that's what they are at the baseline. I'm sure if they were to be not widened and have separate pedestrian and vehicle routes, they would be an improvement. So what I'm saying, it's about what I'm assessing is a future scenario against the baseline scenario.
Yeah. But the people using them for recreation obviously regard that as an adequate, even pleasant resource for doing so. Agreed?
I don't know what those people think because I'm not those people.
Yeah. Well, you've anticipated what people might think using public footpaths throughout the site with hedgerows on both sides. So should we have a guess?
Well, I've stayed. I can't because I don't know what people think of it. I know what I would think of it, but that's not the same as what the existing residents think of it. The residents spoke yesterday as to their views of the routes, and I think they said that they often use the footpaths across the site in preference to walking along those roads. So that would suggest to me that they don't find those roads an attractive place to walk. Just because it's used by someone, it doesn't mean that it's the choice to use it.
Okay, so not an attractive route to walk, but nonetheless one to which you've attributed medium to high sensitivity to its users because you say they're using it for recreational purposes.
Yes. in part.
Right. So shall we record in there as well that that's a less desirable place to walk than the footpaths on site on the
I
road?
think I think the residents said that yesterday in their presentation.
There is no reason why. Okay, let's talk about physical impact first of all. The footpaths will still be available for use.
Yep.
And they will be maintained for use as footpaths. You may have visited site recently and you'll know that some of the footpaths are obstructed by vegetation, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that makes them less able to be used by people walking over the site.
I would have said so.
Yeah. That will be, if the solar farm were implemented and those footpaths maintained throughout the lifetime of the scheme, that would be an improvement in terms of accessibility of the footpaths, wouldn't it?
I disagree. I think there's a legal obligation to maintain the footpaths in a navigable way. So the fact that they're currently overgrown, you can't then say, well, we'll maintain it and that's an improvement. I don't think that's a correct position. I think they have to be maintained. I know there's an issue with public rights of way in Hertfordshire generally.
Yeah, I mean that's the nature of footpaths that go through arable farmland, though, isn't it? When the crops grow, footpaths become more difficult, not impossible to traverse, but sometimes more difficult because occasionally you're having to.
It can be, but that
with
doesn't.
crop.
Yeah, but there's still a right to do that. And actually, my experience is the well-used footpaths like these ones, that's less of an issue because generally there's the constant sort of, it stops the crop ever growing. It's often the very little used footpaths where they're harder to traverse because they don't get that constant use.
The other point, of course, about crops that are grown in field and a variety of crops might be grown, but there are some very tall crops, aren't there?
Well, there are.
So for example, a rapeseed crop can grow quite tall.
Yeah.
And we know we've seen pictures from the residents that rapeseed's been grown on this site. That would, in respect of footpaths, create the tunnelling effect that you're speaking about for some of the footpaths through the site.
Yeah, for a couple of months between when it's grown to full height and when it's harvested. So that would be a very temporary effect.
The form of mitigation planting that's adopted here in respect of screening the panels on both sides of the footpaths, that is commonly adopted in solar farms throughout the country, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And has been regarded as an acceptable approach in solar farms throughout the country.
It's been used elsewhere and has been accepted. And I think Landscape Partnership in their report make it clear that they think it's a suitable form of mitigation. My personal view is that it's very often landscape tries to hide something, in this case solar panels, it can equally be housing, but has an impact in blocking the views itself. And what I'm assessing is the impact on those views. So there is the risk is that the mitigation can be as harmful as the whatever it is trying to mitigate. And my personal view is that planting hedgerow 3 meters high isn't a suitable approach.
Would your position then be that the hedgerow should be removed, opening up views to the solar farm? Would that be a preferable position?
I don't think it would be a preferable position. I think it would be negligible. It would be no difference really.
Okay. So let me just record that. There's no difference between having open and unobstructed views to solar farms as compared to looking at a hedgerow while using the footpath. That's your evidence.
In terms of impact over the baseline, I would say no.
Okay. I have your approach on that. The next point I want to think about, please, is nighttime effects.
Mm-hmm.
Of the scheme, because you've identified adverse nighttime effects, both in respect of character and visual receptors.
As did the LVA, yeah.
And I looked in vain to find a policy basis to understand your objection in respect of landscape and visual matters on nighttime effects arising from a solar farm, because it's not a project which emits light.
I think there's some light, there's security lights, and there'll be infrared light associated with the cameras.
So the lighting essentially is a security light that will be off during the operation of the solar farm unless there's a need for people to visit the solar farm and turn them on at night.
Okay.
Which is expected to be a
So
rare
it could be
event.
light. Yeah.
So an inherently dark development. You accept that?
Yeah, the solar panels, I suppose, are inherently dark, but there is lighting proposed.
The proposals are clear that there won't be any lighting of the appeal scheme at night. That's the position.
Unless the security lights need to be turned on or something.
Unless there is a need for someone to visit the solar farm at night for any reason.
Yeah. So in that scenario, there would be light, but yes.
Okay. So it's in that scenario that the impact that you identify would arise.
Potentially. And I said, and there'll be, when you get infrared security cameras, which I think are specified, there's a red, you see an infrared light.
Okay. Well, I'll discuss the detail of that in due course. But so I can understand it. It's the impact arising from the infrared light on the camera and a security light. If
in terms of visual impact at night,
yes,
because obviously the rest of the time you can't see it. However, what I would say is if you're in close proximity to it, there is also a visual impact because you can see at the moment there's no hedge, so there's no panel, so you have a perception of it even at night time, is my point.
Right. So you have.
So it's not lighting. I'm assessing the visual impact of the panel. So you would still see it at night time in close range views. If you're walking along a footpath and there's a hedgerow, or something to your side, you can see it.
Okay.
Even at night.
This is for the people using the footpaths at night.
Yes.
We can assume that's going to be, or they're going to be less well used at night than they are in the day.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair point, isn't it? Yeah. And it's the perception that behind the hedgerow there's a solar panel, and that's
and the hedgerow itself, because I've already made clear that part of the visual impact is the hedgerows themselves.
So the hedgerows are going to be harmful in terms of visual impacts at night.
Yeah. On a full moon night, it can be almost everything is visible. It's not the idea that it's pitch black and you won't be able to see anything more than a few inches in front of you isn't the reality. On a full moon night, if I'm not even on full moon night, the majority of time at night you get good visibility because of the moon.
Yeah.
So the visual impact doesn't disappear magically at night time. It's still a visual impact. It's a lot less, but there's still a visual impact.
Okay, it's a lot less. So it's a consideration, but if we can put it this way, it's not an overriding one.
No, I mean, personally, I wouldn't have done a separate nighttime impact, but the LVIA did do a separate nighttime impact. And my role is to review the LVIA and put forward the council's case. So that's what I did.
Okay, so you personally wouldn't have done it. You would have scoped out nighttime impacts as being
probably
an important consideration. All right.
My point is, if you're going to do a nighttime impact, you have to assess it. You can't ignore it. And the reality is that it's physically is there at nighttime. It doesn't disappear at night. So there is an impact at nighttime.
Okay. No, appreciate that. It's not going to disappear every night, Mr. Reynolds. Can we agree this then, that the nighttime impacts associated with this solar scheme, either in respect of landscape character or visual, are not significant? I'm asking you for the purpose of the inspector's decision taking. Is this something that the inspector has to grapple with in her decision letter? The significance.
I don't think it adds greater significance than the daytime assessments,
okay.
But I don't think I've said in any of my assessment that it has a significant nighttime impact, but I'm just going to double check because I don't think I would have done. I think the only one, actually I have, yes. So the viewpoint 6, I've said that it will have a significant nighttime impact, which is the viewpoint we looked at when I went through my evidence. Okay. So that's where you've currently got a low hedge bank and you're going to have a high fence. So I think if you walk along there at night, your view will still be worsened as a result of the scheme.
Okay.
But it's only going to be an impact on the very close-up views.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, let's delve a bit more into visual effects now as our penultimate topic. by looking at inquiry document 1. The first table 1 is landscape effects. We've dealt with that. Table 2 is the visual effects table that sets out the comparison there. And then table 3 is the new viewpoints or additional viewpoints that Mr. Morris added to his assessment. And you've gone on in your rebuttal to provide an assessment of those, which is helpful. The point I'd like to understand first from these is when we look at table 2 and your assessment of the viewpoints prior to the production of those additional viewpoints, you've assessed the effect at post decommissioning as neutral.
Yes.
In all, if not most cases, I think.
I think in all of them.
In all of them. Right.
It might be actually no, there might be one. Sorry, no, I think visual. It's neutral in all of them.
Visual neutral in all of them. That's helpful. So that's on all of those, and we can see actually, Mum, I don't know if you still have the viewpoint location plan, but we can see where all of those views are, and the views, of course, are representative of particular receptor groups traveling through the landscape.
Yeah.
And if we turn to your proof, please, at 4.2.59. What you're talking about here is about the decommissioning, post-decommissioning effects.
Yeah.
And you say, while the removal of the solar panels and associated infrastructure would be visually beneficial at that point, the assessment must be made against the baseline situation, i.e. the views today.
Yeah.
In effect, what is being assessed in that scenario is the effect of retained mitigation planting over the existing views.
Right.
While the retention of planting may bring ecological and biodiversity benefits, it will actually cause a negative tunnelling effect for those on the rights of way through the site and will not make a noticeable difference to wider views. The views today are typically of a rural agricultural scene, and that is what they will be again. The fact that there may be additional hedgerow or tree planting will not be an improvement in the view. It will just be a change. And that's why you come up with your neutral effect. So what you're saying is really the adverse effect arises from the impact of the scheme behind the hedges. Because once the scheme's gone, you accept that it will just be a change in the view, but it will be a rural agricultural scene that is retained.
Sorry, I don't quite understand what you meant by that.
Yeah, what you say there, go down to the end of that paragraph, third line up. The views today are typically of a rural agricultural scene, and that is what they will be again.
Yes.
So you accept that once the panels are removed, notwithstanding that the hedgerows are still there, this will remain a typical rural agricultural scene.
Yes.
Yeah. But what you then go on to say is you don't regard that as positive because it's still blocking out the views. It's just a change, and that's how you arrive at your neutral.
Well, I'm saying it's the same as it is now. It's
impact.
It's not a better rural scene, and I'm not assessing the year 40 assessment isn't a kind of year 40 versus year 39 assessment. It's a year 40 versus baseline assessment. So my point is that at the moment it's an agricultural scene. Once the panels are removed, it becomes an agricultural scene. And I don't think, as I said in my evidence in chief, I don't think anyone today would say this landscape is lovely, but it needs more hedgerows and trees. So I don't therefore think that in 41 years' time, when there are more hedgerows and trees, it's an improvement over the existing. I think it's a different because there will be more hedgerows and trees, but I don't think it's better or worse. So it's a neutral change.
That's what you've explained.
Yes.
So just dealing with the effect of the hedgerows on their own, if they were put in those double hedgerows, notwithstanding the tunnelling effect that you've identified, that's a neutral impact in and of itself in respect of visual receptors.
Not on some of the ones, but as you said, there's not all of the receptors are affected by the tunnelling effect. So the problem with receptors is, and the way that we do the assessment is they're representative. So you have to balance. It will be worse for some bits, it will be better for others. So it's a balancing exercise.
Yeah.
So the prow across the site are grouped together. So for some of them, there'll be a more negative impact, and others there'll be less of a negative impact. But you have to balance it. You can't do it's not a meter by meter assessment. So it's on balance. So that's why I've come to the point that it's neutral.
Well, no, you come to the point that it's neutral for exactly the reason you set out at 4.259. The fact that there may be additional hedgerow or tree planting will not be an improvement in the view, it will just be a change.
Yes, but as I've also said, it will actually cause a negative tunnelling effect from the retention of planting. So I've highlighted there that just because the panels are removed, it doesn't mean that it's an entirely beneficial change.
Yeah, but what you also identify in the same paragraph, let's just try and agree this. First of all, that the hedgerows and of themselves are not an adverse impact. They're a change. They're neutral.
Yes.
What we still have when you take the panels away is a rural agricultural scene.
Yes.
Yeah. And to the extent actually that the hedgerows do their job and one cannot perceive the panels behind them throughout the operational lifetime of the scheme, that effect would be the same. It would be a rural agricultural scene.
But no, because it won't be 100%. You'll still be aware that the panels are there, as the visualization for viewpoint 6 showed. Even with the hedgerow mitigation in place, it changes the character of the scene, and views will still be foreshortened.
And when you identify these effects, can we just turn within visual effects table 2? And I'm sorry these don't have page numbers, but it's users of the public rights of way through the site. And you've got Kings Waldon 10, 11, 13, 32, and the Offaly footpaths as well. And that's represented by viewpoint 2 and viewpoint 8. But the assessment there is of the receptor group of people on public rights of way throughout the site, yeah?
Correct, yeah.
And we can see there that what you conclude is the neutral effect after 40 years. And you address this, don't you, in your proof of evidence at 4.2.73 on page 36 and in the following text.
Yeah.
So what you do there is you talk about this particular receptor, which is represented by viewpoints 2 and 8. You talk about them being high sensitivity receptors and the magnitude of change. You talk about the tunneling effect that will arise as a result of the scheme. And then, as we know, that brings you to a substantial adverse effect throughout the lifetime of the scheme, but neutral once the scheme is decommissioned.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we then look to the new additional assessment views in table 3, we see there that there are 2 receptors where you have identified a substantial adverse visual effect after decommissioning. For users of the public right of way through the site.
Yes, they're the ones that you get the tunnelling.
And adverse effects also in respect of residents at T Green, users of the public right of way. In fact, there are only 2 of these views where you don't identify an adverse effect post decommissioning.
Yes, because they're smaller receptor groups. So, for example, LM2 is users of footpath 11 explicitly. So what I did there was I looked at people who are on footpath 11. Footpath 11 is the one where for most of the route, most of the length of it, you have the hedgerow both sides of you.
That's between fields 16 and 17.
Correct, yeah, and 14 and 13, I believe. And what you find is that when you look at the original LVIA, users of footpath 11 were also put in with users of footpath 10, users of footpath 13, users of footpath 32, users of footpath 4, users of footpath 5, and users of footpath 6. So what I therefore did is I assessed each of those, and on some of those footpaths, there's no hedgerow either side of you. So this is what I said to you about it's to do with the way things are grouped. So you have to assess the group that it's a receptor of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling with that if I'm honest, Mr. Reynolds, because when we looked at your explanation of these effects at 5.259, you don't say any of that. You don't say what I've done with these effects is I've looked at all of the footpaths that are concerned. I've considered which are going to be more affected and which are going to be less affected, and I've come to a balance. We don't find that, do we, at 4.25?
I don't think I've said it, but I would have thought that it was obvious that that's. Apologies if it wasn't, but that's what you're doing. You're looking at the receptors that is a representative viewpoint of. So where that is multiple receptors, you have to moderate it. It's the simple way that it's done.
But the effects still remain, don't they? And what you don't set out. So your position is, well, not all of these people are going to be affected, and not all of those routes will be affected after decommissioning. If that's your evidence and there would still be some harm arising upon decommissioning, I would expect to see that at 4.259 of your proof. Instead, what I see is your conclusion that post decommissioning, this will return to a typical rural agricultural scene, and the additional hedgerow and tree planting won't be a benefit, but neither will it be a harm. That's what you say at 4.2.5.
It is what I say, and maybe I should have further qualified that as that is, I suppose, probably more appropriate in terms of longer distance views where you're talking about the scene rather than an immediate view. So
because we are talking about there, aren't we, at 4.2.59? And tell me if I've identified the wrong receptor group. But we're talking about users of public rights of way through the site. That's the group with which we're concerned.
Yeah, but actually that's, as I've mentioned before, not all of those public rights of way. That includes public rights of way between fields 1 and 2, for example.
Yeah.
Where there's no hedgerow planting either side.
Yeah.
The view looking across field 1 will be completely unchanged as to what it is today. The view across field 2 will be slightly changed. I don't know what that building is, but there's a transformer or something, but that's all. So they'll have, if you were just asking me to assess users on that footpath only, it would be a very low change. So when I'm assessing a footpath with very low change and a footpath with very high change, the only option open to me is to moderate between the two.
And I could understand if that's what you said, but what you said were matters of principle, which is that the views would return to a typical rural agricultural scene, and the new hedgerow planting would be a neutral factor. There isn't there, on the basis of what you've said at 4.2.59 and the outcomes of your table 3 additional viewpoint assessment, there is an inconsistency in the way in which you've approached effects post decommissioning.
I don't think there is an inconsistency. I accept that perhaps it isn't clear in my proof that what I've done is assessed all of those receptors and then come up with an assessment value that is kind of moderated across them. That I would accept. That could have been clearer in my proof, but I don't think that there's an inconsistency.
If that is your case, then what we have to understand from your evidence that is in respect of receptor groups focused on a smaller spatial area of the site, or perhaps single footpath routes, there will be higher impacts than elsewhere on the site where there will be much lower. So this is a variable experience for receptors moving through the site.
Absolutely, which is standard. It's always about kinetic experience.
Yeah. And in respect of those views that Mr. Morris added, of course, that they weren't views that you felt compelled to bring to the inspector's attention. You didn't add any additional viewpoints to your assessment.
I didn't feel that there were any viewpoints that were missing.
Okay, that's helpful.
The viewpoints that Mr. Morris added in are already covered. As I said, he's added in, for example, footpath 11. Well, footpath 11 has already been assessed as part of the group with the other ones. So I don't really see what advantage that or how that differs.
The only views where you identify a moderate or greater effect at year 10 and beyond are all on the site boundary, aren't they?
Within the site or on the site boundary, yeah.
Yeah. And what that tells us about the visual effects of the scheme are that they are localized by comparison with the red line boundary.
Relatively, yeah.
I don't plan to go through the visual material because they're best left for the site visit, and the inspector's already stomped all over the site and is going to do so with copious quantities of sun cream on Friday again. But if the inspector wants to understand the effects that you've identified on those receptors, it will be necessary for her to understand and assess the components of your judgment, so value, susceptibility, and magnitude.
I don't know that. Well, I think that the inspector would make her own assessment of those things.
Yeah, are you here to assist the inspector?
Yes.
Okay, so the inspector's going to have to look at your evidence, isn't she, to see what assistance can be gained from it?
Yes, and I've set out what my review of the final position is on all of those.
Yeah, and you say the final position, and you caveat it in that way because there are building blocks of assessment that take us to the final effect, aren't they?
When you're undertaking LVIA, yes.
Yeah, you say when you're undertaking the LVIA, but if you're here to critique an LVIA and provide a judgment, which is not just a little bit different, but in some circumstances, Mr. Reynolds, significantly different, then one might expect you to set out your reasoning for the differences in judgment. Yes?
I think I have the approach that I took in my proof was...
I'm not asking you about the approach you've taken. I'm asking you a matter of principle now.
Yeah, so I've done that for the ones where I felt there was the greatest difference between us.
Okay. So if the inspector is looking at those areas where there is the greatest difference, the inspector could reasonably expect to find, set out in your evidence, what the value and susceptibility of those receptors is and what you say the magnitude of change is going to be.
Yeah,
that's the reasonable.
I've set that out where I believe it would be helpful. However, ultimately, it's for the inspector to undertake her own assessment of those things and to come up with a conclusion. And that will either be match my conclusion or Mr. Morris's conclusion or the LVA conclusion, because there are some cases where all three of us have come to different conclusions.
Yeah. Can I put it this way? What I don't find set out in your proof is your judgments on value, susceptibility, and magnitude for each of the receptors that you provided an effect.
Receptors, because I don't believe that that's my role and requirement. My role isn't to prepare an LVIA. My role is to review the submitted materials and then to set what my case is in terms of where I agree and where I disagree.
No one suggests that you were required to carry out an LVIA, Mr. Reynolds, and that's not what I'm suggesting.
Well,
now.
I would argue that if you're suggesting that I should have set out all of those factors for all of the viewpoints, that is effectively undertaking an LVIA.
Well, no, what I'm suggesting is that where you disagree with the judgments arrived at in the LVIA, and you set out that you come to a different overall effect, then to understand how you got there so that weight might be placed on your judgment, one has to understand the building blocks that led to that judgment. Because what you're doing is you're asking the inspector to accept a different judgment on an overall effect. That's what you've done. You provided overall effects in respect of those receptors.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that I don't think how I got to the answer, if you like, is what matters. I think what matters is I say it's A, Mr. Morris says it's B, the LVA says it's C, and the inspector will make her own mind up. I don't see how, knowing whether it was because I had the higher value or higher susceptibility, that what matters is if I've identified a substantial adverse impact, and the inspector will decide whether she thinks there's a substantial adverse impact. So I don't think how I've got to that answer is what matters. The inspector will look at, for example, year 40 on users of the Prowse to the West and decide whether she believes it's moderate adverse or substantial adverse.
Okay, so the building blocks aren't important. The building blocks of the judgment, the way in which we assess the sensitivity.
When you're undertaking an LVIA, they're important, but not when you're reviewing an LVIA.
Well, the point of having your methodology, we explored this yesterday, Mr. Reynolds, is so that the judgments that are set out can be transparent.
Yeah.
So that they can be traced back by the decision taker to understand how one arrives at the overall effect, which is the important point for decision taking.
Yes, and
Yeah.
as I said, I followed the methodology that's set out in the LVA document,
Yeah.
which I'm sure the inspector will also follow that methodology, and then come to a conclusion.
Yeah. So that's the other point. The inspector will want to understand the extent to which the effects you've identified do follow the methodology set out in the environmental statement LVIA, yes? Because that's what you say you've done.
Yes.
Yeah. And in order to understand if you have followed faithfully that methodology, the inspector would need to understand what your judgments are at the stages of the process that are set out in that methodology. Yes?
I don't agree.
No.
Sorry.
No. Okay. One example we've been able to identify a difference between us arises from 4.2.76 of your proof. If you turn that up for me, please.
Yeah.
4.2.76, and that's on page 36, and that's internal page number. So what we have here is 4.2.76 is the receptor group that you're looking at is users of the public right of way. You set that out at 4.2.74.
Mm-hmm.
And you've attributed high sensitivity for walkers on the site. That's the basis of your assessment.
Correct. Yeah.
High sensitivity.
Yep.
And when we look, and I should say actually high sensitivity, and when we look at the table, what that equates to, you don't set out the magnitude of effect, but it gives rise to a substantial adverse effect
Okay.
for
Yep.
those users. So that's what we're dealing with. We can see that table too, forgive me, users of the public right of way. So we've got, you say high sensitivity, and that arrives at a substantial adverse effect. When we look at the methodology, that's called document 117. Can we just turn that up?
Yeah.
One 1.17, and it's page 65 of the PDF, 65 of 71.
Yeah, I've got hard copies. Yeah. Which doesn't have page numbers.
Oh, figure 6.4.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the one dealing with visual sensitivity. We can see there, of course, that the two components of sensitivity set out value and susceptibility. And a distinction is drawn, just cast your eye over to the value side of that, a distinction is drawn between the sensitivity of people who are in or visiting national and locally designated areas and those where the views one might be experiencing are from undesignated landscapes or townscapes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, with susceptibility, what we've got at the top of the scale is users who are on residential streets, users of long distance recreational routes, national trails, visitors to heritage assets, those sorts of things. And then in the middle, we've got views from public rights of way, rural roads, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to come out with the high sensitivity, as you've identified, what you would need to have is value and susceptibility at the top of both of those trees. So people who are...
Well, not at the very top. That's not because medium, high, and basically medium to high can be a medium to high as a scale. So I would have said in the upper third of those two, definitely.
So you'd have, well, if we look down to the susceptibility table at the bottom, the only way you get to high is by having high value and high susceptibility. You see that?
Yeah, but high value and medium susceptibility is high/medium.
Yeah, well, you've said high. That's why I'm dealing with the term high. That's your evidence of 4.2.76.
Yeah, but that's a gradation. So I would say that you could be high or medium for that.
Sorry, I'm totally confused. Can we take this back a few stages? You have used the descriptor or the term high sensitivity. Yes. You get to high sensitivity on this methodology by having high value and high susceptibility.
Yeah.
You see.
Yeah.
when we look at what that means in the previous table on page 65, that is people who are visiting designated landscapes, national or international, or even at the next level down when we're going towards moderate value, local planning designations like country parks, local nature reserves and conservation areas. You see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. You have equated people using these footpaths through the site with people who are visiting national and internationally and locally designated areas. That's what you've done. That's the only way you get to high.
Well, it's just EG, so it doesn't mean that's only those factors. But I have said put it at the upper level of that. Yes.
Yeah. On this methodology, someone using the footpaths in this site is as sensitive as someone visiting the national landscape to the northwest.
It's a scale.
Yeah,
so I wouldn't. No.
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 Right. So where else is there to go? Because your sensitivity is as high as it can get.
But it's a scale, isn't it? So it doesn't mean that I'm absolutely at the top of high. So I would still say it's high because I still think that but it's not as high as a national landscape.
So are we to understand there's a grey area now in your
No, I don't think there's a
descriptors?
grey area.
So it doesn't really mean high.
I'm not saying high doesn't mean high. I'm just saying I believe it can be high and not have to be within an internationally designated landscape.
Well, you might believe that, but what does the methodology that you say you
Well, that's what I read from the methodology.
So you read from the methodology that in order to be high value, that can be viewed from an undesignated landscape on footpaths that are locally used. You think that can get you into the high category of sensitivity on this methodology? Is that really your position?
No, but I think it can get you in medium to high.
Okay, well, why haven't you used medium to high then? Because that was an option open to you on the methodology, wasn't it?
No, it isn't, because my point is that it only has medium or high. So what I'm saying is that I placed it somewhere between medium and high.
Look down to the next figure in the methodology. What do you see?
I see a table that has a row for medium and a row for high for value. Is that correct?
Look at the receptor sensitivity. So this is the overall. You'll see a lovely teal hue on that table.
Yes.
Yeah. And you see the categorizations there. High, we've got high, medium, medium, low, low, negligible, and negligible. You see that?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. You chose high.
Yes.
That's at the very top end.
Yes.
Are you saying the receptor sensitivity should be reduced to high medium? Because that was open to you and it's not what you've said.
No, what I'm saying is, point to it on here. So this row is high, this row is medium. So if my judgment is between medium and high, I don't put it in the top row because it's not high. I don't put it in this row because it's medium. I put it medium high. So what I therefore say is, okay, well, that's somewhere that would place it effectively on the line. So it's high or high medium. So then when you do the same thing across, you end up in the middle.
So tell me,
What
is your
I'm
case
saying- what I'm
that you're
saying
putting
is-
between high,
What I'm
medium?
saying is this is a scale. It doesn't say it's high if it's this, it's medium if it's this. It has a scale, but this isn't a scale. This is fixed. It's 4 categories.
Yeah. Well, you have to use your judgment, don't you, as a landscape professional when you're
Yeah,
when you're
exactly
applying
what
this.
I've done. Yeah.
And your judgment in this case, as I've said, is that the sensitivity of a receptor using this footpath is as high, according to the methodology, as someone using the national landscape, because the sensitivity you've ascribed to them is the highest it can get. There's
Yes.
nowhere for you to go.
Yes, but that I would say that is then a fault in the methodology.
You haven't raised any issue with the methodology, have you?
No, I haven't, because I don't think it's an issue. You're the one who's saying it's an issue, that it has to effectively, there's not a way of, the way that it works is you assess the receptor against the categories. What you don't say is this isn't an internationally designated landscape, therefore it can't be a high impact on anyone. That's not the way it works. The way it works is you look at the category and you undertake the assessment. It's not my fault if there isn't a higher category for an internationally designated landscape.
Well, there is a high category. It's there. It's set out in the methodology. What it means is that this footpath or the footpaths through the site just don't reach that level of sensitivity.
Okay, well, if that's the way that the assessment has been done, then that's why we've got a difference of opinion, and the inspector can make her own mind up when she visits the site.
Yeah. Because applying the methodology, the sensitivity of users on the site would be lower than that which you've ascribed to them, wouldn't it?
Well, like I said, I don't think it would be, but it's a matter of judgment.
Okay. Cumulative effects next then, please.
Yep.
And the first place we're going to go is 3.1.1, which is the officer report.
Yep.
And it's 4.10.40 under the heading cumulative impact, which is page 43 of the PDF.
Yeah.
So we know that cumulative effects, both with east of Luton and the airport, are the two relevant developments that we're looking at.
Yep.
Neither of those schemes were of concern for the officer in respect of this proposal. Didn't consider that gave rise to unacceptable effects. The officer obviously was aware of both of those schemes, by which I mean nothing was left out of account in the assessment. So it's not your case that the inspector has to have regard to some other development that the officer wasn't considering here.
No.
And that assessment was, of course, assisted by the review from the Landscape Partnership.
Yep.
And their assessment of cumulative impacts. And what's said within the officer report from 41040 is officers are conscious of the extent of large-scale development proposed close to Wandon End and the eastern side of Luton, with the east of Luton urban extension and the Luton airport expansion subject to a current DCO application. Both sites have live applications. And then it goes on to look at the planning practice guidance, which talks about the need to undertake cumulative assessment, and then looked at the different headings within that guidance and carried out an assessment under each of them. You see that?
Yep.
And that assessment starts at 4.10.42. And under the first heading at 4.10.42, which is cumulative landscape impacts and cumulative visual impacts are best considered separately. Cumulative landscape impacts are the effects of the proposed development on the fabric, character and quality of the landscape, and concerned with the degree to which the proposed renewable energy development will become a significant or defining character of the landscape. Mm-hmm. So we know we're dealing here with landscape matters, and the officer goes on to deal with both landscape and visual considerations, yeah? And I asked the inspector, of course, to read all of that at her own leisure. But what we find on page 44, just above Roman numeral 2, is officers consider that because the form of development of the solar farm would be quite different to that of housing and or airport development in its permanence, traffic movements post-construction, character, appearance and materials, and conclude that there would not be a great impact on the visual cumulative impact on the development. You see that?
I do, yeah.
And then we see in respect of 2, which is dealing with views or sequences of views and the impact on people experiencing those views. What's said by the officer is the solar farm will create a significant feature in the landscape, although temporary and reversible, which will lay with the landscape form within field parcels and go with the topography of the land. The site will be visible in the shorter distance, mainly from the south and west, but not in the longer distance. The solar farm will be particularly visually intrusive within the site, and views from public right-of-ways within the site will be worst affected, although limited to the application site only. Officers are not concerned about the views from the site towards the housing or airport development.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think in respect to the housing development, that's a view you share as well.
Yeah.
And then it's about cumulative impacts arising from 2 or more of the same type of development is the next consideration. And that's about other solar farms in the area. And the officer explains why that's not really a problem either. So we can agree in respect of cumulative impacts, they were noted by the offset and assessed, but were not regarded as unacceptable in respect of this scheme.
Correct.
Yeah. And is it right also, Mr. Reynolds, that for you, it's not the cumulative impact that's unacceptable, it's the impact of the solar scheme itself primarily with which you're concerned?
Overall,
Yeah.
yes. I think what I highlighted in my proof is that I do believe there will be some cumulative impacts. That's a landscape cumulative impact with the housing and a visual cumulative impact with the airport proposals.
Yeah. And the visual point with the airport proposals is about the planting that's proposed as part of the DCO.
Correct,
and the
yeah.
potential that that has to block views as well.
Yeah.
And obviously that's an impact that the Secretary of State regarded as acceptable.
On its own merit, yes.
Yeah. And as to the landscape character impact of the East of Luton, of course, the East of Luton scheme means that that area that's allocated will come out of the landscape character area with which we're concerned.
Yeah, when it's reassessed, I would assume it would do.
Yeah. And the fact that the council consented a large development for a couple of thousand homes in that character area tells us something about its ability to accommodate large scale development, doesn't it?
Not necessarily. It tells us that it was allocated.
Yeah.
I don't think it's been fully consented yet. And the landscape character assessment is fairly clear that it probably can't accommodate that. We looked at that yesterday. However, it was allocated.
Yeah. So a judgment was arrived at.
The judgment was arrived at that it should be allocated, but obviously that was based on a number of factors. I don't know what all those factors were. It doesn't mean that because it was allocated, it could accommodate it. It may not have been able to accommodate it in landscape terms, but it was decided in the round that it was the most appropriate location for it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the inspector can tangle through the knot of that answer.
Yeah.
The airport expansion DCO, I don't know if we have to turn up these documents or what your knowledge of that is, but part of the DCO examination assessed the cumulative impacts of Luton Airport with this scheme, didn't it?
I don't know whether it did or not, to be honest with you, but
you don't.
I'll take it as read that it did.
Okay. All right. Well, let's turn up the documents then, so that you've got, although if you've not read them, it might not be of much use, but certainly it will be for the inspector. 5.2.1b is the examining authority's report. And it's 983 pages. So my suggestion would be to do a
number, was it
5.2.1b.
Okay.
My suggestion is to do a Control F and type this in 3.23.15. And that should take you to page 375 of the PDF. 23.15.
Yeah.
You see that? You got that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the examining authority's report, and what's said there is in response to BCG 2.4. I mean, the acronyms are lovely. They're all at the end of the report, thankfully. But the Hertfordshire authorities provided updates on the Wandon End solar farm and Bloor Homes applications. The examining authority requested that the applicant provide comment on the implications of these developments for the conclusions of the ICCE, which is, forgive me, it's the cumulative in combination and cumulative effects report. In their representations, the applicant confirmed that the Bloor Homes development had been taken account of in the cumulative assessment, but stated the Wandon End solar farm application had not been fully considered in the ES at the time of submission, but that it had subsequently updated Chapter 21 to fully consider the development and resubmitted it D10, that's representation deadline. The application confirmed that this did not, the applicant confirmed this did not alter the conclusions of no new or different cumulative effects, and the examining authority sees no reason to come to a different conclusion. So we can see there that the applicant for the airport expansion assessed as part of its cumulative impacts assessment, Wandon End Solar Farm, and provided those results to the examining authority.
Yes.
Yeah. And the examining authority saw no reason to come to a different conclusion, that it didn't change the effects of the airport, which we know are considered to be acceptable because that now has a development consent.
Yes.
Yeah. And when we go to 5.2.1c, that's the Secretary of State's decision letter, 5.2.1c.
Is that the same document?
No, it's a different document, C rather than B.
Okay.
And suggest you do a search just for paragraphs 363, which will take you to page 77.
Yeah.
So 363. And what's said there is, like the examining authority, the Secretary of State has had regard to the applicant's assessment of in combination and cumulative effects with other consented and proposed developments at each of the receptors included in the landscape and visual impact assessment, and notes this identified no changes to the landscape and visual impact assessment conclusions on significant effects. You see that?
Yep.
So we know that it's been taken into account, and of course the DCO has been consented. And that it gave rise, certainly in that case, to no additional effects over and above Luton Airport's own.
Well, yeah, no additional significant effects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Bear with me a moment, please, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's fine. 20 minutes to the fire alarm. So.
Yeah, I just had one question
Yeah.
that's not been dealt with, which is on, it touches on the kind of what we've just been covering actually. It's 4.287 of your proof on page 40.
Yep.
Where you're talking about stretches of the public right of way, where there's only planting on one side, but with combination with the airport works. But you say there may be stretches. I just wondered, well, is there or isn't there, and where would it be? I wanted to understand where.
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you, it's a little bit woolly because of the way that the level of detail that's in the DCO. So the DCO basically has a red line along the footpath and say that it's reinstating hedgerow. There isn't a kind of detailed landscape drawing to the level of detail that we've got for the appeal scheme to be clear exactly whether that's kind of a new hedgerow, a reinforcement of the existing hedgerow, and whether it's on one side or both sides. There was also a question around where that might overlap and whether some of the effectively the mitigation for this would already be put in by the airport and the rest of it. So I don't know that from the material I've seen that I could be explicit as to where that would occur, which is why I phrased it in that way.
Well, thank you. You can stand down. Thank you very much. Oh, oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. Re-examination.
I've only got one question.
I was getting so excited at coffee time.
Just allow me one question.
Yes, sorry, of course. Yeah.
Good morning, Mr. Reynolds.
Hello.
If you could cast your mind back to the dim and distant past of yesterday afternoon.
Yeah.
You were asked a question about the extent to which, if at all, the east of Luton development would cause severance of the Breachwood Green landscape character area. And Miss Osmond Smith very fairly said you could go in and check that if you wanted. I'd like to ask you to do that compare and contrast job. So if I can ask you to look at Mr. Hughes's proof of evidence, which is CD 12.3. And it's PDF page 70 of 77.
Sorry, what was the document number?
CD 12.3.
Yeah.
PDF 70 of 77.
Yep.
And can I ask you to also turn up Mr. Morris's appendix, which is at CD 11.1.3.
Yep.
And I believe it's PDF page 60.
Yeah.
So you should be looking at LM.01, the landscape character areas in Mr. Morris's appendix, which are depicted by different colours.
Yep.
And you'll be able to see the Breachwood Green Ridge area in blue.
Yes.
And then if you can look at Mr. Hughes's planning proof, hopefully you can look at them side by side.
Yeah.
Page 70 of 77 shows the East of Luton housing development site in purple.
Yeah.
And my understanding is the question you were asked was about severance, as in, would the landscape character area be severed from, I suppose, southwest to northeast with the East of Luton development? And can I ask you for your view on that, having now looked at the plans side by side?
The overlay, you can see that it would be. There's kind of the woodland. There's quite a distinctive curved woodland that shows that that's effectively the edge of the character area, and that's also where the allocation goes up to.
Thank you. I've got no further questions.
You really can stand down this time.
Thank you.
I'm going to suggest we break now then and come back. What's the time? Yeah, if we come back after the fire alarm, just after 11, rather than start anything else. Right, Ms. Osmond-Smith, would you like to call your first witness?
Thank you, Mum. Yes, I will. And I will introduce Mr. Morris to the inquiry. Hello and good morning, Mr. Morris. I'm going to introduce you from your proof of evidence, section 1. And at 1.1, you set out your qualifications and experience, and you tell us you are Lee Morris, your managing director and co-owner of TIR Collective Limited, a landscape architecture consultancy based in Cardiff. You're a chartered member of the Landscape Institute. You hold a degree in physical geography, a postgraduate diploma in landscape architecture, and a master's degree in landscape architecture. You're a practitioner of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment and an approved building with nature assessor. You have over 25 years professional experience in landscape architecture at regional, national and international multidisciplinary consultancy companies. That's all correct.
Yes, that's correct.
Your professional experience, you tell us, is wide ranging, and that's at 1.1.2, where you tell us the projects that you've been involved in, some of which include renewable energy developments, and you've acted as an expert witness on landscape and visual matters at appeal hearings and inquiries. 1.1.3, you talk about your involvement in the scheme, which we'll get into as we go through your evidence in chief. And importantly, at 1.1.4, you say this: that the evidence that you have prepared and provide for the appeal in this proof of evidence is true and has been prepared in accordance with the guidance of your professional institution. You confirm that the opinions expressed are your true and professional opinions. Is that all correct?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. You might need to get a little bit closer to your microphone.
Okay.
You're quite
Is that
softly
better?
spoken, just so we can all hear you. And my first question for you is you came to the scheme late in the day. You weren't involved in the application process. So what steps did you take, Mr. Morris, to satisfy yourself that you were able to support this scheme through this inquiry?
Yes, so I became involved in November 2024. And the first stage was to walk the site and the context of the site to understand the setting and the site itself. And as part of that process, I prepared a zone of theoretical visibility so that I could understand the visual envelope for the development. And I also carried out a review of receptors. So the zone of theoretical visibility informed that, where I defined who are the visual receptors and what are the landscape receptors. I went through all that process before I started. And then I also reviewed the mitigation strategy on site to confirm its effectiveness and where it could be improved. And the outcome of that process is the appendices to my proof, Appendix LMO1, which is the Landscape and Visual Appraisal Addendum.
Yeah, so we've got that here, and that's the main document to which we're going to be referring, core document 11.1.3. which is your landscape and visual topic paper.
Yeah.
And this sets out essentially your assessment of the scheme. It includes drawings, which we'll go to in due course, and photographs, and also the additional receptor points. But can I understand broadly what your approach to this assessment, both in landscape character terms and visual matters, was? How did you set about the assessment?
So my starting point was to review the existing methodology in the submitted LVIA to establish that I was happy to use that methodology, because it's much more effective to continue using the same methodology than to introduce a new methodology with different definitions of terms. So I continued with that methodology after review to establish that I was happy with its approach. Which I was. It is GLVIA 3 compliant, and also compliant with the Technical Guidance Note 2401, which provides an update to GLVIA 3. So I established that I was happy with that methodology, and also that that the definitions of terms at each stage of the assessment I was happy with as well. So I confirmed that I was happy to take that forward for landscape and visual appraisal, which is a non-EIA version of an LVIA.
And what's the importance of that distinction? And I'm thinking particularly in reference to the term significant and the significant effects that were identified by the LVIA.
Yes, that's right. So in the updated guidance note, so TGN 2401 of GLVIA 3, it confirmed that for non-EIA development, there's no need to assess significance in EIA terms.
And help me with this, the LVIA methodology defines what significance is. It's anything over moderate, but then seems to identify effects lower than that, which is the significance. Are you able to?
Yeah, each methodology has potentially a different threshold. Some methodologies will have the threshold at moderate major, some will have it at moderate. It's important for the assessor to define where that threshold is based on the definitions of all the terms.
So for this inspector's purposes, is the label of significant important, or is it the overall effect that we get to throughout the lifetime of the scheme that she needs to concentrate on?
It's the overall effects. The reference to significance becomes irrelevant when it's defined as non-EIA development.
So you're content with the methodology that was used,
Yes.
and I don't think actually there's any dispute between us and the council that that's an appropriate GLVIA compliant methodology. You did, however, add additional viewpoints into your assessment. Why have you done that? Obviously, it's given an opportunity for the council to give their views, and we end up with some more substantial effects. So help us with that, Mr. Morris.
The views used within the LVIA were confirmed as acceptable by all parties. So additional views were added in during the process. So it wasn't that the views that were added in were insufficient. It's the role of the assessor to consider the representative views against each of the receptors. And I felt that receptors moving through the landscape were underrepresented by the views submitted within the ES. So I felt that further views helped to explain the localized visual envelope, which is, it's all within half a kilometre. So I provided some additional views near the site boundary and within the site to explain public right-of-way receptors.
And through the provision of those additional viewpoints, I mean, does the assessment of this site get worse? Does it become more harmful through the identification of those additional viewpoints?
No, it doesn't. By using the originally submitted representative viewpoints, it's the role of the assessor to reflect that change in experience, the transient nature of the views using from the public footpaths as part of the assessment. But I think the additional views help to explain it further.
And when you've provided your assessment of effects, both on landscape receptors and visual receptors, you've set out, I've called it throughout this, the building blocks that lead to the judgment of overall effect. And those building blocks we're familiar with, its value, susceptibility and magnitude. And how important is it to set out your assessment or judgments on those building blocks before fast forwarding to the overall effect?
It's absolutely essential, and it's very important to understand the definitions of all those terms along the way. By simply presenting a different conclusion, it's not clear how the definitions within the methodology were used to define susceptibility, value, sensitivity, and magnitude. So I've gone through those stages to reach my overall conclusions on each receptor.
And when you've reviewed what Mr. Reynolds has done on behalf of the council, to what extent have you been able to discern the judgments he's arrived at in respect of those building blocks?
Inconsistently applied. So there are very few references to magnitude and very few references to sensitivity. And where there are references to sensitivity, by interrogating that, it starts to reveal departures from the methodology. So as we heard earlier, when for the few receptors that are listed in detail, where you can actually discern the level of sensitivity, when you start to unpick that, you can see that value and susceptibility, there's a departure from the methodology. So It's only for, I think it's 4 of the receptors where that's done fully. But for those, you can see where there's a departure from methodology.
And in terms of those departures from the methodology, I suppose one might depart and it would have no real overall effect on the outcome of the judgment if you weren't identifying a very high effect. For example, in this case, what's the effect of the council's departure from the methodology?
Well, the departure on susceptibility and value can create an elevated sensitivity. We don't really know to what level there's a departure on magnitude, but they are the building blocks that feed into the overall assessment. So it undermines that overall assessment if you can't see transparently exactly what definitions were used along the way and what judgments were made. The methodology provides a structure for the judgments made.
So you say it undermines the judgments. So what's the effect of that? What reliance or weight can be placed on the council's assessment of effects in this case?
Where there isn't a clear, transparent assessment, it cannot be relied upon.
And we're dealing essentially with 2 strands of this topic. We've got landscape character and visual effects. Does that error infect just one of those topics or both?
I believe it affects both, yes.
Just by way of summary, are you able to just explain that before we get into the detail of those points?
Yeah, so in terms of landscape character, the value applied to Breachwood Green Ridge is medium to high. So when you start looking at the definitions of medium to high, you can see reference to terms that are, I would say, aren't consistent with the landscape itself. So high is a very distinctive landscape, high quality and no detracting features. So you can see on site that that isn't a correct description of the site. Even at a medium level for value, it's reasonably distinctive. Features that are commonplace may exhibit some detracting features. So we can see that when we get down to medium, we're starting to hear descriptions that are consistent with the conditions on site. And then at low as well, relatively bland or commonplace. The reference to bland is in the landscape character assessment description for area 202. So it's describing the landscape in terms that's already in the landscape character assessment published by the council.
Yeah.
So that's where I think it's sitting between that medium and low description, using the definitions within the methodology. That's where it takes us in terms of value.
Yeah.
It doesn't push us up to high, where you're starting to hear a description. The description for high value for me sits with a designated landscape. It starts to talk about the national landscape to the northwest.
Yeah.
So by elevating it, it's distorting the assessment.
Okay. And what you've done as part of your Appendix 1 is you've produced a sensitivity comparative illustration, if I can put it that way. That's LM02, which sits behind the landscape character areas plan. Forgive me, I'm not, it may be PDF 61. It's somewhere around there, I think. In the appendices, in the landscape and visual topic paper, yeah. So we're going to come and look at this in a bit more detail. I don't necessarily want to get into the finer points on that first, but that's essentially a plan you've transposed from the landscape character assessment on the relative sensitivity of those areas.
It's showing value, so it's part of the sensitivity.
I see.
So it's half of sensitivity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll come back to that in a moment. And what I want to do for now is focus on the source document for that plan, which is the landscape character area assessment. And that's at core document 6.5.1. 6.5.1. or in the appendices to your landscape and visual topic paper,
Yes.
whichever is easier for you.
Yes.
Feel free to go there. And we know we're concerned with area 202, which is the Breachwood Green Ridge character area. And that begins on page 97 of the PDF. And Mr. Reynolds agreed that this is the starting point. This is where a landscape professional goes to begin to understand what the relevant character of the landscape is and how that might be changed. So how have you informed your judgment on landscape character effects, both on this character area and those which are surrounding this character area as well?
Yes, so this feeds into the desk study along with the national character assessment as well. And the role of this is to inform the field work, which is my own understanding and appreciation of the landscape. And it's really important to visit adjacent areas to understand where the differences exist, and understand how well this the assessment actually defines the features of the landscape and its overall character. So I use this area, and particularly Lily Bottom, which is to the north, and use this description to help my understanding of the differences between the two character areas.
Yeah. And what is the outcome of that? And I'm thinking now on that comparative basis and having regard to the plan that we see, your value plan at LM02 in the landscape and visual topic paper. What's the difference between those areas? One of which, of course, includes a national landscape.
Yes, that's right. So I think a really good location to understand that difference is viewpoint 12, which is identified for the site visit. From that location, you can get a really good understanding of Lily Bottom, and you can see the differences in the defining features of the landscape. The features that make up the landscape are all the same. It is hedgerows, trees, woodland, and landform. And those features are the same in Lily Bottom as they are in Breachwood Ridge. They're the same features that make up the landscape. But landscape character is the combination of those features and how they work together to create a distinctive character. And from that relatively elevated location, viewpoint 12, you get a view across Lily Bottom, looking northeastwards, and you can see the landform. You can see the patchwork of fields, a stronger field pattern. There's a lot less degradation of field pattern. The defining features of the character area are landform, so it's very well defined. Comparing that to our site, the distinctiveness is very different. So that's an important part of it. So within our site, you have degraded field pattern, so that makes it less distinctive. And you've also got the introduction of detractors, which you don't see in Lily Bottom. Particularly from viewpoint 12, there are no visual detractors. You still get a little bit of aircraft noise, but you don't have visual detractors to the same level that you do on the site.
To what extent does it assist to understand the nature of adjacent and nearby character areas when calibrating the overall sensitivity that you ascribe to our character area in which the solar farm sits?
It's essential. So looking at the differences between the character areas and relating that back to the definitions within the methodology, those building blocks of the assessment, understanding how value and susceptibility are different between those character areas, that is important. Definitely, that is the basis of the assessment.
So when we look at the overall character area assessment for area 202, you'll have heard Mr. Reynolds' evidence yesterday about it, and he has some criticisms about the description that's provided in that and why he departs from it and thinks it actually this is probably a more sensitive landscape area than the character area assessment would identify. how relevant and accurate is the character area appraisal in your view?
I think it is accurate. The description on page 45, where it talks about tranquility and the impact of the airport, I think that is a very accurate description of it. It's the airport is obviously visible in the landscape from the public footpaths within the site, but it's important to recognize the activity and movement within the airport, which are part of its visual impact. Seeing aircrafts move around within the airport, aircrafts taking off, landing, the noise of the aircraft, that is all part of the impact of that airport on the landscape.
And of course, this is a sort of a long and narrow character area. And some of the detractors in the character area assessment don't apply throughout the character area, do they? Where are those detractors most obvious in this character area?
They're most obvious where there's uninterrupted views to the south, or where there's more of a lack of field pattern, where the edge of built development can have an impact, more of an impact than it would otherwise. So it's many of the public footpaths within the site where you have uninterrupted views to the southwest. That is a detractor to the visual amenity of the views.
And just bearing that in mind, that looking at the overall characters of this area, and particularly the adjacent character area of Lily Bottom, what Mr. Reynolds says is actually, I think this site, at least in this part of the character area, the study area that I'm concerned with, reflects the characteristics of the national landscape. And that elevates its value beyond what the character assessment would lead one to believe. Can I have your view on that, please?
I disagree. There are stark differences between the landscape character of Lily Bottom and the site, particularly when you stand in the character area and just take note of the condition of it, the distinctiveness of it. Lily Bottom is a higher value landscape than the Breachwood Ridge. And that comes through in the published landscape character assessments.
So putting the value as he does, Mr. Reynolds, of the site and the character area as medium high, where does that leave one to go in respect of the most highly valued and most highly sensitive landscapes, like national landscapes, like character areas such as Lily Bottom, which are more sensitive in your opinion?
It doesn't. It means that all landscapes become compressed right at the top of the methodology. That's not what the methodology is about. The methodology is to accurately categorize the landscape based on value and susceptibility, which I think the published landscape character assessment does. Looking at the description of high, there are elements of that that are consistent with Lily Bottom. So I can see why Lily Bottom has been...
Should we go to the methodology? That's core document 117 at 65.
Yes, sorry, I've got it in front of me, so I was just talking to it. I was looking at figure 6.1.
Six point one.
Yes, which has the definitions of value and susceptibility. So I was just looking at those in relation to the characteristics of Lily Bottom and Breachwood Ridge.
Yes.
So when you look at those definitions of value, both the top band at high and the medium band through the middle, there are elements of both of those within Lily Bottom, which is it's consistent with the published landscape character assessment, which defines it as medium to high. There aren't any of those high features within our site. Our site sits medium to low, which is consistent with the definitions within the methodology.
Yeah, and so we're dealing with two things essentially here: the site and the character area, insofar as it relates to the study area around the site. And does your evidence apply to both of those things?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, because we know that a part of the site does fall into the Lily Bottom character area.
It does.
So how do you approach that?
It is distinctly different. So that part of the site is most definitely part of Lily Bottom. And you get that sense. I mentioned viewpoint 12. You really get that sense from viewpoint 12. Those fields are part of the defining feature of the Lily Bottom character area, and you can see why they were included. So I would approach the value of those fields differently to the rest of the site.
Understood. Thank you. So looking at that methodology, then it's a straightforward question. Does that support Mr. Reynolds' finding of medium to high value for the site or the character area within the study area of the appeal proposals?
No, it doesn't. As I said, the elements referred to within the high categorization of value, they're not present within the site. And that's also backed up with the assessment of landscape value within my proof. I've done an assessment of landscape value based on the TGN 0221, which sets out a methodology for assessing the value of landscapes outside designated landscapes. So I've done that assessment as well to back up my judgment that this is not high value landscape.
Have you seen any comparable assessment from the council in respect of the value of the site?
I haven't. So that goes back to the other point about following the methodology. What we're presented with is the conclusion. There isn't the evidence and the justification for all the decisions you have to go through along the route to get to that conclusion. It's inconsistent.
And what Mr. Reynolds says about that was, well, I'm not doing an LVIA. I'm not expected to do an LVIA. And if I'm required to set out all of those judgments, then in effect, what I'm doing is I'm carrying out an LVIA. Do you agree? Is that an answer to the point?
I disagree. I think whilst not doing a full LVIA, in order to assess the effects on a receptor, I can't see how you have to go through the route based on the definitions and the methodology. You have to go through that to reach a conclusion.
And what about susceptibility? What do we know about Mr. Reynolds' approach to susceptibility as compared to yours? Turning again to the methodology.
Yes, so that's defined as high to medium again. That judgment is inconsistent with the nature of the development. If we were looking at this landscape in relation to an urban extension, for example, that would bring me more closer to the high to medium susceptibility, because it's a complete change of the landscape and it's unsympathetic to the pattern of the landscape. Our proposed development sits at lower level because the development itself is low lying. It respects the topography. Not only does it work within the field pattern, it restores that field pattern. So it's a lower susceptibility to the type of development we're looking at here.
There's no disagreement, of course. It's within the GB Clivia and the methodology that susceptibility is about the specific development that we're looking at. But when I look at the definition here, I see reference to undue consequences arising on the condition, quality and defining characteristics. So just thinking about those three different matters, the condition of the landscape, what's that and what changes with the scheme in place?
Yeah, so landscape condition is one of the things that's reviewed within the assessment of landscape value that's contained within my proof. So this landscape is defined as lower quality condition because of the degradation of field pattern, which is reflected within the published landscape character assessment. So that pulls it down on the susceptibility because the pattern is degraded already.
Yeah.
So it increases the importance of restoration of that pattern too.
Yeah. So that's condition. What about post scheme? What's the condition of the landscape like if the scheme is implemented?
The condition of the landscape is higher. It's the restoration of field pattern to the extent that post-development, post-decommissioning, the site would be closer, it would be similar in condition to Lilybottom in terms of its restored field pattern, a stronger field pattern. You'd still have the visual detractors of the airport, for example, but the field pattern itself would be restored. So it would be higher quality, better condition.
So that's, I think we've covered condition and quality, haven't we?
Mm.
I just want to think about the defining characteristics as you see them of this area. And what I'm really interested in, Mr. Morris, is having regard to those defining characteristics as they currently exist, both on the site and the character area in the study area. What actually changes with the scheme in place about the defining characteristics? What makes this area what it is?
So through the development, one of the defining characteristics is landform and topographic pattern. That is unchanged by the development. Its field pattern and the network of public rights of way. The network of public rights of way is actually enhanced through the development, through the introduction of the additional footpath leading across to Stony Lane and Viewpoint 12, which I mentioned. And the field pattern is restored as well. And what the restoration of field pattern, why that's really important is because it restores the landscape to its previous condition, where it's a more intimate landscape. There's greater enclosure, like you see in Lilybottom, the adjacent character area. And through that, the impact of detractors is reduced.
Thank you very much. Next topic then, please, is about what Mr. Reynolds says is about the distinctiveness of this landscape. You've touched on this briefly in sort of your overall summary of the departure from the methodology, but Mr. Reynolds says that the site falls somewhere between the reasonably distinctive landscape and the very distinctive landscape thresholds in the value side of the equation. Do we find an explanation of that anywhere in the council's proof of evidence?
No, it's not explained. Again, I think this is where value is elevated, and it means within the methodology, it doesn't leave anywhere else to go in terms of national landscapes and higher value landscapes. The definitions for high aren't consistent with the site.
You'll recall the evidence when he was questioned about it that Mr. Reynolds gave yesterday about what was distinctive about the site. Do you recall that?
I do, yes.
And what of those features that Mr. Reynolds identified, the topography, the hedgerows, the trees, what of those are either reasonably or very distinctive landscape elements?
They're not distinct. They are, as I've said, it's the elements of the landscape that combine to create that distinctive landscape character. And when the field pattern is heavily degraded, the distinctiveness is diminished, and the differences between the two areas will become apparent on the site visit.
I want to look next then, do you have anything more to say on the methodology or issues of value susceptibility before I move on to the mitigation strategy?
It's just making that point again about simply saying this is a very distinctive or it's a distinctive landscape. That statement has to be qualified with reference back to the methodology, and I think that's the omission. That justification is missing.
So the next document then is called document 8.3.1, which is the enhanced mitigation strategy. And we know from the chronology that's set out in various documents, including the Statement of Common Ground, that the scheme has evolved through the application process. the first question is, why was that, and what were the main changes that happened at the application stage?
So the main changes involve the emission of fields out of the solar arrays. So they are fields 1 and 2 down in the southwest corner, and fields 18 and 19 up in the northern end of the site within the Lily Bottom character area. And also some other changes where field 4 was removed also. So the more visually sensitive parts of the site, or the parts of the site that had the potential to be harmful for higher sensitivity landscapes, those elements were removed from the solar array layout.
And then when you were instructed, you produced the enhanced mitigation strategy that we see before us now. And what I want to understand, first of all, is why. What was your justification and reasoning for that? And then following on from that, what are the benefits of this mitigation strategy over and above the plans that the committee considered when it refused the scheme?
Yeah, so the submitted mitigation strategy was effective. I agreed with all the measures included, and I think it offered effective mitigation. The enhancements were based on a review of a walk around the site and trying to think of the experience of the footpath users and nearby residents, and how the mitigation could be strengthened to reduce the effect of the development on those receptors. So the number of locations are on the western boundary. There's additional mitigation between the edge of the solar arrays and T green. There's already a buffer set in the development back there. The proposal for standard trees, it would provide effective mitigation, but by underplanting, it provides better mitigation of the visual effect on the adjacent residential receptors. And based on the methodology, those receptors are the highest level of sensitivity. So it's important to make sure that effect can be mitigated. There's further mitigation for residential receptors at field 13 from receptors from Millway. There was already mitigation included there, but by adding another row of mitigation, not only does it provide a layered visual screen, which is more effective, it also increases the amenity value of field 13, which is set aside for public recreation. So it mitigates the effect on those future recreation users of field 13 also. And there's also the additional hedgerow on field 16 to reduce the impact of the solar arrays on the public footpath.
And to what extent do the landscape proposals here accord with the guidelines set out in the landscape character area evaluation? I think I've called that document about 10 different things to date. The LCA assessment, whatever we want to call it. To what extent does this scheme follow and comply with the guidelines set out?
Yes, so in recognition of the relatively poor condition of LCA 202, at the end of the document, there's a section on improve and restore, which makes recommendations for mainly for green infrastructure and how it can be enhanced. There are 9 of those, and I believe that looking at those 9, we contribute positively to 4 of them. So it makes a strong contribution to that improve and restore part of the assessment. So based on that, I'm looking at the second bullet point, for example, between intensive arable, so buffer zones between intensive arable production. So we have got that sort of buffer to intensive arable production. The third bullet point is on hedgerow restoration, which we're doing. The fourth point is promote the use of traditional field hedges in place of post and wire enclosures. So we're introducing new field boundary hedgerows, and also the the 6th bullet point also, promote the diversity of hedgerow species. We're able to do that too.
What about the next one?
Yes, so yeah, we are extending the public right-of-way network, particularly on the northern side of the site. That's a really important connection.
So let's just look at that. That's on the enhanced mitigation strategy, and we can see, I think it's denoted by a blue line.
Yeah, that's right. So
going from south, or the field that's denoted to the south of the label field 18.
Yes, that's right. So the existing public footpath from Millway over to T Green comes out on Stony Lane, just on the northern side of T Green. If you wanted to walk the public footpath, which is north of Stony Lane, users would have to walk that section of Stony Lane, and as you'll see on site, it doesn't feel particularly safe. It's quite narrow. It's slightly incised, and it's a fairly straight section, so cars travel quite quickly along there. So the public right-of-way keeps footpath users within the site, following the northwestern edge of field 18, allowing a perpendicular crossing point to Stony Lane to then use the other footpath on the other side. So it increases public safety as well as improving the experience for footpath users.
And that, I think, takes us neatly on to the issue of the footpaths through the site and the tunnelling effect that's alleged by the council. And I'd like to talk about that alleged effect. First of all, do you agree that a tunnelling effect will arise on the public rights of way?
I disagree. The nature of public right-of-way users is the transient experience from walking the public footpath. It isn't one particular location that defines that experience. It's easy to look at a single assessment viewpoint and think in that way, but we're actually assessing the experience of using the whole footpath. So as passing through this landscape, there are a number of situations where there's a hedgerow on one side, hedgerow on two sides. You're walking through woodland, walking along a greenway or a bridleway. That change in experience defines the experience of the landscape. So it's not a tunneling experience. It's just different levels of enclosure and framing open views. It can be as well.
Mr. Reynolds has proceeded on the basis that the width of the footpaths would be around 3 metres with hedges on both sides, and mused that might be an unpleasant experience. First of all, do you know what the widths are of the footpaths where this effect arises?
Yes, they vary. The narrowest location is 9 meters centre to centre. So that's on public footpath 17 and field 17 and field 16. The double hedgerow between those two are 9 meters centre to centre, which equates to 7 meters clearance between foliage. And there are others on the site where it's wider, actually. Between field 5 and 11, it varies from 14 to 20 meters centre to centre. So there are variations that reflect it reflects the alignment of the public footpath and also the historic field pattern. If the public right of way just happens to be further away from the historic field boundary, then the corridor is wider.
And how does that compare to other routes in the area through woodlands, for example, bridleways, or if people are using the roads for recreation? What are we talking about, that sort of width?
The experience would be consistent. Many of the lanes, so Stony Lane, there are sections of that. It's 3 to 3.5 meters between hedgerows, and also the road itself is incised. So it is quite a narrow corridor you're moving through in places, and some of the woodland you can be completely enclosed. But that change in experience is part of the experience of using public footpaths. It's that's just part of the experience, really, that change in enclosure.
So in your view, would the additional planting make those routes unattractive for users following implementation of that planting?
No, I don't believe it would.
And what about in the future? Because that's the other thing that Mr. Reynolds says, that, well, whether it's neutral or harmful, there's a distinction between the effects he identifies for different receptor groups. But let's proceed on the basis that in future, that over the baseline, that's a substantial adverse effect to have the hedgerow planting there because you're blocking out views. Can I get your view on that, please?
I suspect that's an inevitable outcome of his position on the severity of the effect and it being adverse. If it is an adverse effect, once the solar farm is decommissioned, that adverse effect has to remain, which that shows how odd a position it is, really, because walking through the countryside with a hedgerow on each side, that isn't an adverse experience for a public right-of-way user. I think that's entirely consistent with the experience of other public rights-of-way in the area. There is, as I referred to before, the benefit of field boundary restoration is that the experience of the landscape becomes more intimate and more consistent with its historic pattern, and the effect of detractors is diminished also. So in the future, the effect of the Luton Airport expansion, for example, will be reduced on footpath users because the hedgerows are restored and the field pattern is restored through that. There
aren't there, sometimes promoted viewpoints that people can travel to, usually in high places, but not always. And you might attribute a greater value to those views because they're promoted, because they're advertised, because people travel to get there. And if you were to block that up, then you might assume a harmful effect on that view. Does that situation arise in respect of the site?
No, it doesn't.
And would there be anything to prevent the landowner preventing or planting hedgerows and trees within the landscape?
No, they wouldn't. There are a good number of initiatives that encourage the restoration of field patterns because of the wider benefits they bring for amenity and biodiversity. It's encouraged. It would be a very positive outcome for the landscape.
And the landscape character assessment here unashamedly promotes new planting as part of the restoration of this landscape character. Does that express a concern over the extent to which views, important or not, might be blocked as a result of that planting?
No, it doesn't.
Anything else to say on hedgerows and public rights of way?
No, I don't think, other than there is a point of legibility. My experience of walking the public footpaths in the site is you get that impression of field pattern loss, because you'll be walking along a footpath from T Green, for example, and then you suddenly take a right angle turn to the left, go a bit further on, and then a right turn to the right to head towards the heath. Those sharp turns in the public right-of-way network they're a remnant of the field pattern. They made sense when there was a field pattern there, but in the current field pattern without hedgerows, it feels a little strange, I think. So I think the restoration of field pattern will make that the existing public right-of-way network make a bit more sense. So it improves legibility of the landscape also.
Thank you very much. The next issue I want to deal with is the adverse landscape character effect that Mr. Reynolds identifies arising through this proposal spanning the width of the character area in this location. And we can see that from the plan that you've provided within your Appendix 1, which is, I think, PDF page 60.
Yes. LMO1, is it?
Pardon?
LMO1, is it?
LMO1, yeah,
Yes, yeah.
exactly it, yeah. And we can see there how the red line extends from the adjacent character area to the south of Kimpton and Whiteway Bottom. It's
Yes.
charmingly named places here, right? And Lily Bottom to the north.
Mhm.
And that's identified as an adverse effect by Mr. Reynolds. And I want, please, to have your opinion on that.
Yes, so the site spans the width of the landscape character area. In this location, landscape character areas are defined largely by topography, which is why they run in that sort of northwest, southeast direction. The site does span the width of the character area, but the proposals actually enhance the defining features of that character. So it doesn't diminish from those characteristics. And in fact, post decommissioning, we have a restored landscape that is higher quality than it is now.
Next topic, best and most versatile agricultural land. What Mr. Reynolds says about that is the omission of that consideration from the LVIA is significant. And I want your view on that, Mr. Morris, please, from a landscape and visual perspective.
Yeah, so I haven't commented on BNV. I don't think it's not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't comment on it. I think the point Mr. Reynolds was trying to make is that the soil itself is a landscape resource, which I agree with. It is an important finite resource that sustains green infrastructure, so it has an important role. But from a landscape and visual impact perspective, there isn't a notable impact on topsoil on this site. All the topsoil stays on site in its current location. In fact, the mitigation strategy, if anything, enhances the condition of that soil. So I would scope it out of the landscape and visual impact assessment for that reason.
And nighttime effects? What's your position on that?
Yes, I scope that out as well. Without activity, movement, lighting, I wouldn't include it in the assessment. I don't see what the impact is. I think there's a claim that someone walking the public footpath at night would have a sense of the public of the solar panels, even if they couldn't see them, or they'd have a sense of the hedgerow. I use public footpaths at night, so I have experience of that as a trail runner. So people using public footpaths at night tend to have their focus on the ground in front of them so they don't fall over. So I don't think it's necessary to include nighttime assessment in the LVIA, and that's why I scoped it out. I also think there was mention to the potential for lighting during a security issue on site. That's a rare occurrence, which I would equate to agricultural machinery during harvest. It's an infrequent tractors at night harvesting. You would have lights at night, but it isn't an impact that needs scoping into the LVIA. That's why I removed it.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. The next question is broadly on Greenbelt, and what Mr. Reynolds says about that is that, quite apart from the infrastructure of the scheme and the spatial impact that would give rise to, there is an additional adverse effect on openness because, again, the planting, and that will harm the openness of the Greenbelt permanently. And I want to understand your view on that, please, the extent to which landscape mitigation, enhancement planting is capable of affecting openness of the Greenbelt.
Yes, it doesn't. It's whilst planting and green infrastructure can increase enclosure. That's enclosure from a landscape experience perspective. It doesn't equate to openness within a green belt. So I disagree completely with that point.
Visual impacts then, please. And the first thing I want to do, please, is look at the zone of visual influence of the appeal site, which is you include at LM03.
Yes.
which also, I think, doubles up as our viewpoint locator plan as well.
Yes. Yeah, so
Having regard to that, how do you characterize the extent of the visual envelope, that area over which the scheme will have an influence?
so it's a localized visual envelope. One of the reasons that I reran this was because I wasn't certain on the parameters of the original zone of theoretical visibility. In the methodology, it mentioned something about mitigation being included, but it was a bit vague. So this is a worst case zone of theoretical visibility. It includes the impact of built development and woodland, but it doesn't include the impact of the mitigation strategy as part of the scheme. So it provides that worst case because I wanted to make sure I knew exactly where all of the development, including the mitigation, would be visible from. And what this shows is a zone of theoretical visibility that's heavily defined by topography. That strong pattern of the landscape character areas running northwest to southeast, you can see that within the zone of theoretical visibility as you would expect. So at the northeast boundary of the site, visibility actually stops at the site boundary where the land falls away down into Lily Bottom. And then the other side, as the landform starts to rise up again, then we get visibility, which is shown as viewpoints 5 and 10 on the other side of the valley. Near the site itself, it's heavily constrained by built development. So you can see the impact of T green on the western boundary. That diminishes the visibility beyond that point. And then looking on the just to the west of viewpoints 9 and 3, you can see there where visibility diminishes as the land falls away. That's where the zone of theoretical visibility ends. So it's a very well contained visual envelope. There is a large zone of visibility down to the south, but that's actually the runway of Luton Airport. So that's there's not really any receptors there that would be safe to assess. So that's not included. But in terms of the site itself, it's largely within half a kilometre of the site boundary, which is it's very well contained for a site of this size.
Thank you very much. The next thing then I'd like to do, please, is take out your tables, which were updated in Form Now Inquiry document number 1. And understand, please, where the big differences are between you and Mr. Reynolds, both for table 2 and table 3, really, because those are the visual effects tables. And we can see how you've used something of a traffic light system to denote the levels of effect. So if you can just help, as an overview, understand why and where those differences arise between you.
So the main differences occur on public footpaths within the site or near the site boundary, and primarily on the additional viewpoints, which is slightly strange because in a position where an assessor is happy with the viewpoints presented and you're considering the effect on all the receptors, in theory, having some additional viewpoints shouldn't change your stance as an assessor because you had to consider those receptors as part of the original assessment. So I was somewhat surprised when I saw the differences in opinion that came through the additional viewpoints that weren't necessarily there within the original assessment. But the main impact...
Well, just before we move off that, in your opinion, is the assessment that's been carried out in respect of those additional viewpoints at table 3 consistent with the earlier assessment that Mr. Reynolds has carried out, particularly in relation to the post-decommissioning effect?
No, it isn't. So that is most apparent on users of the public right-of-way west of the site, in the west part of the site. So that's the original assessment, viewpoint 2, which you'll notice in this table that there are two entries there, despite it being a single photograph. That's quite normal in an assessment where you've got a representative viewpoint that's used to represent two receptors. So one of the receptors it's representing is residents of T green, so that's high level of sensitivity. It's also representing footpath users, which are moderate level of sensitivity, medium sensitivity. So you have to do two assessments for the same viewpoint because you've got different levels of sensitivity. That's why I have two entries there. But what's interesting is in Mr. Reynolds' assessment, we're now presented with substantial adverse effects after decommissioning, where that didn't occur on any of the original viewpoints. And that one is actually one of the original viewpoints anyway. That viewpoint 2 is one of the original viewpoints. It's just used to represent different receptors.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Go back to the point you were making then in respect of the viewpoints where there's big differences between U and Y.
Yes, so users of the public right of way west of the site, viewpoint 2. So my assessment is medium sensitivity receptor, consistent with the methodology, and at construction, great level of effect, which puts it into the higher category. I've used major rather than substantial, just because that's my own methodology doesn't use substantial, but major use is the same as substantial for the purpose of this assessment. So we're in agreement at that point, although Mr. Reynolds hasn't confirmed magnitude or sensitivity, but we are in agreement in terms of our severity of effect. As the mitigation establishes, and then post decommissioning, my assessment diminishes as that mitigation establishes, and then after decommissioning, it becomes a beneficial effect because then you get the benefit of field pattern restoration, as discussed earlier. Mr. Reynolds' assessment is consistent as substantial adverse throughout the life of the development, and the final one is permanent. That's forever.
So, as you say, when you look at the impact, the impact of mitigation on visual, we can see that you have a reduced effect over time. And to be fair to Mr. Reynolds, in some instances, he also reduces the effects over time. For example, if we look at table 3, sorry, table 2, apologies. We can see reductions as we look through the changing colours on the bottom row, if I can put it that way. There are some reductions in respect of some receptors, but not others.
Yes.
How consistent is that approach with your understanding or the way in which you've approached the mitigating effects of planting hedgerows and trees?
It isn't consistent, and I think it comes back to that transparency point. If sensitivity isn't confirmed and we can't see the level of magnitude attributed to it, we can't actually tell why there's a difference in opinion here. But the fact that it diminishes for some receptors and not for others, that's an inconsistency, really. I don't quite understand that. Where the mitigation itself is apparent in the view, you would expect a reduction in the scale of effect.
Okay, is there anything else to say on visual impacts, Mr. Morris?
No, I don't believe so. I mean, there are other views. So LMO1, LMO2, there is a difference of opinion. So it just reinforces that point really about the effectiveness of mitigation is it appears inconsistently considered within the assessment. Within Mr. Reynolds' assessment, it's inconsistently applied. I can't quite work out why, and the supporting text and the conclusions, which is what we're presented with, it doesn't seem consistent, and I can't quite understand why.
And there's a point there, isn't there? Because you started that by saying there's a difference of opinion. And
Yes.
there may be a case where two opinions are equally valid and can be relied on and attributed equal weight. Is that the case here?
That's always the case where the methodology is followed. So if Mr. Reynolds was to say, I believe it's a large magnitude effect, whereas you're saying it's small, we can see where the difference is and we can look at the methodology and understand why there's a difference. But that's not what we've got here. We're not presented with all the information, so we can't see that.
Thank you very much. The last topic then I'd like to move to is cumulative impacts, and we're concerned with two other developments, East of Luton and the airport expansion. And I want to understand what your approach is to the potential for those cumulative impacts to arise with both those developments.
So with East of Luton, there's a couple of elements there. There's the intervisibility, and there's a timing element to that also. So intervisibility is a small part of the site near the access road to Tankyards Farm, where you can get glimpsed views down into the area of land that is part of East of Luton. You can see the surface of a few fields. So it's a very small part of the site where that intervisibility exists. That's for a number of reasons. It's because of the topographic pattern, but it's also T Green itself. The built development of T Green actually is a barrier between intervisibility for some parts of the site, largely the northern part of the site. So we've got a very small part of the site where there is intervisibility. The timing element to that is we don't know when East of Luton would actually come forward. So it's a good number of years off. So we don't necessarily know to what extent the mitigation measures within our site would actually reduce that intervisibility. If it was 10 years away, for example, then our mitigation measures would actually screen that intervisibility between that small part of the site where there is currently a view and East of Luton. So it's a very small part of the site. There is some intervisibility, but if it's a good number of years away, then that would be removed by the establishing mitigation strategy for the site.
And of course, those planning applications are behind this one.
Yes. Yeah.
To what extent will the East of Luton planning applications have to take into account any impact in combination with our scheme when they come? Well, I mean, there have been applications in since before it was allocated. So let's assume that there are new planning applications. This site has a consent. To what extent do they have to accommodate that?
Yes, so that they would be responsible for considering the cumulative impacts of their own development in combination with our development. But there's also a timing element there as well. So it's a very large site, 2,100 houses, I think. So that will be phased. The part nearest our site where the intervisibility exists from a small part of our site, that might end up being the last phase of development. And there are buffer zones and green infrastructure proposed as part of the indicative master plan. Those could come through in advance. So we'd have additional screening within East of Luton itself that would provide further screening. So there's quite a few unknowns there, I think.
One of the points the officer made in the report when considering cumulative impacts was that there's a difference between solar development and housing development. And I want your view on that, because you use a similar phrase in your proof of evidence that the scheme is functionally, characteristically and visually different. How important is that when considering cumulative impacts?
Yes, it's very important. So our development will sit within the field pattern, largely screened by existing hedgerows, certainly more distant views where the receptor is a similar level to the site, and topography doesn't give that sort of view where you can see some of the ground surface of the site. So our development sits down into the landscape. It's low lying, as we've heard previously, but built development is quite different because it will introduce taller elements which are more likely to be seen above screening vegetation. So it has a very different impact, and it's in its character, it's urban. So it is obviously built development that East of Luton will introduce into the landscape, whereas our site is it's a landscape-based land use that it doesn't read as an urbanizing influence.
And what about the difference in respect of noise and activity from urban development and a solar scheme? Is there a distinction to be drawn there?
Yes, it's very different. So I would expect very little movement and activity within the site, little to no noise. So it has a very different impact than built development.
And so that's cumulative with east of Luton urban extension. What about the airport? What are the effects there?
The impact, I would say there there is the increased visibility of the additional land taken into the airport as part of the DCO, but I think it's more to do with the additional noise of flights and activity actually visible within the airport. But I think this comes back to the restoration of field pattern within the site. We are users of the public footpath within the site, and existing residents would have, I suppose they would have a greater degree of separation from those effects by having the field pattern within the site restored. In the longer term, that would soften the impact of the Luton Airport expansion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morris. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of kind of questions which I think I'll ask now because they're more kind of just clarification. Now, I think you don't need to look this up, but it's in one of your appendices. You set out new planting. I think you say woodlands, coppice, and scrub planting. I just wanted to clarify what you meant by woodlands, what you meant by coppice, and what you meant by scrub planting. I've got things in my mind, but I want to make sure that that I'm on the right track.
Yes. So woodland would be predominantly tree species, so taller in its nature in the long term. Coppice tends to be more shrubby species, but it can include trees as well, and that's managed on a rotation. So it will be coppiced depends on the species, but it could be every 5 to 10 years, I suppose. It would be coppiced, which is cutting off at the ground and allowing to regrow. And then scrub is predominantly shrub species with a height that's generally 5 to 10 meters tall when mature. So it's shrub planting is more consistent with hedgerow species generally.
Thank you. And just in the main proof, now I need to look this up myself. Page 20, starting at page 23, I've got it as where you've got some tables summarizing the visual effects, and then from page 27 onwards, so you've got summary of visual effects within the ES Livia. So are these then the conclusions that take no account of the enhanced planting? From page 27, that the table that starts at halfway down page 27.
Yes, they would be. They are reproduced assessment that's in the LVIA.
Right, yeah. So that's the kind of worst case.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's fine. That was just the two kind of things I wanted to clarify.
Okay.
Miss Daly, do you want to start now, or and break in about 45 minutes, or is it better to break now and come back? Yes. Yeah, that's fine. And then if we break for lunch, and it's quarter past one all right for you? I know, yeah, you sure? You don't need to half one. No, right, well, at 1:15 we'll come back then. Thank you very much.